Love letters. Handwriting of the heart. The point of this presentation is to explain how an EKG or an ECG is really just like a letter written from the heart. And learning to read these EKGs is like learning to read a new language, and we have to approach that in a similar fashion. And understanding that, like handwriting, each person's heart has a different type of handwriting. It may look differently. It's unique to each person. Here we recognize a squiggly line, and we can probably associate that this is a line from an EKG. And for those who can read the heart's handwriting, they would see that this is a normal sinus rhythm. And what is that doing? What is it saying? Well, what it's saying is, I'm working normally. And that's the heart's way of saying, hey, all of these things are happening as they should be, and here's my way of expressing that to you. Hey, things are going well, and I'm working normally. And we just had to see that rhythm and learn to read it so that we know things are working as they should be within the heart. So how do we see what the heart is trying to say? Well, we use this tool, as I'd mentioned, called an ECG or an EKG, and it's an electrocardiogram. And what that does is it takes the electrical impulses or the electrical signals from the heart, and it converts those to a written form on graph paper. And that lets us be able to visually see what the electrical energy of the heart is trying to tell us. So here's a visual representation of what that looks like. We have a sick heart that is putting off electrical impulses, and we're observing the electricity that's flowing from the heart. So if we don't know the language of the heart, what the heart's handwriting looks like, if we don't understand what those impulses mean, it can be like looking at a foreign language. We know there's something here, it's trying to tell us something without having an idea or a knowledge of what these different symbols mean. It really doesn't communicate what it's truly trying to express. When we're not able to read the heart's handwriting, it really is a failure of communication. The heart's clearly expressing that something's wrong, but we're not able to receive those signals because we don't know what their language is. We don't know what this representation means. So we're not able to help these patients if we're not able to identify what the problem is by what the heart's trying to say. If we think about when we first started learning language, and I assume if you're listening to this presentation that you're familiar with the English language, so we didn't start out by having full words. We learned the alphabet, and this is 26 unique symbols. And if we think about it like a unique symbol has a representation, and we know looking at it what A is and what sound that makes, but it's really a representation. And if we approach EKGs in a similar fashion, it's a little bit easier to break this down and make it into a form that's easier to learn and understand. So on this slide, what we have is the heart's alphabet. And these are the shapes and symbols that the heart is using. And if we think about this in the same way we did with our traditional English alphabet, then we can start to break things down, and we see when these different waves or shapes are grouped together. This particular one represents a sinus rhythm, but it's composed of different shapes that are linked together. So if you think of that the same way that the different shapes from our alphabet are linked together to form words, and those words have different meanings, then that's the same way we approach these EKGs. With the different waves and different shapes grouped together, then we get the full representation of what the heart is trying to tell us. So we talked about A and the alphabet, and we know that A makes the ah sound, and the word apple was probably one of the first words that we learned. And we learned that by association, and we started to build on that. So we knew when we saw that letter A, it makes that same sound ah, like an apple. So now if we apply that to EKGs, here we can see the P wave. So this is the start of this complex or this full rhythm, but it starts with P. And every time you see P, it doesn't mean it's the same complex. This is just the start of this specific one. So if we think about it like that, we can understand that each wave may be represented in different forms, but if we know what the meaning is behind what we're seeing, then we can apply that to different rhythms. So with the approach of learning EKGs like we learn basic language, we know that we didn't start out with the complex words. We started out with smaller words and started building on those. So with EKGs, we'll start out with more simple things, and then we can add more pieces to that. So as things become more complex, we have a better understanding, but we don't jump in over our heads. We want to start out with more simplistic ideas and then build upon those. This slide's a bit complex, but the point that I'm trying to make is that each wave that we see is a representation of the electrical impulses. Well, what each electrical impulse is doing is creating a mechanical function of different parts of the heart. So what we're doing is when we see the electrical impulses or the specific waves, we know that those are associated to specific mechanical functions of different parts of the heart. So like learning the basic language, this is probably one of the first rhythms that you'll learn when you're trying to cover this complexity of the handwriting of the heart. And this is the sinus rhythm. And we see that the sinus rhythm is made up of specific waves. So as we go through and we learn the different waves, it's more important to understand that this is not just a sinus rhythm, but it represents that the function of the mechanical parts of the heart are working appropriately as they should be. Now to get into where the association really is like handwriting. So each person's handwriting is different and unique. So if you imagine these different fonts represent handwriting, we can see that all three of these spell cardiology. But each symbol is shaped a little bit differently. And this is where it's important to know what the symbols are and what they represent. And they can look differently, but the specific way that they're presented will help you understand what the heart is trying to express. So different rhythms will look differently. And that's why this approach of understanding EKGs like a form of language or handwriting really becomes important. So like on the previous slide where I had cardiology written 3 times and 3 different handwritings, if you will, here's a sinus rhythm that's presented in 3 different handwritings. So each of these represent a sinus rhythm and a normal sinus complex. But you can see that the waves look different in each one. So if you're understanding that the wave is representing what's going on the mechanical side of the heart, it's just the electrical impulses we see, then we understand that things might look differently, but the deeper meaning is still the same in each of these examples. So in conclusion, oftentimes we really overcomplicate what an EKG might look like, and without the full understanding and digging deeper into knowing the importance of understanding what we're looking at and what functions are happening in the heart, when the heart is writing us a letter, we're better able to understand what's going on. And if the heart is functioning normally, if it's happy, then it's writing us that letter and it's explaining that to us. If something's wrong and the flow of electricity is interrupted, then we can start to break it down and understand what parts of the heart are affected and why those things are occurring. So it gives us a good representation of what the heart's trying to tell us. So in conclusion, I think the importance of this is to understand that the heart is going to tell us what's going on. It's our job to really dig in and understand the language that it's using.